Thank you very much. I've had woman flu, which of course is vastly worse than man flu. I'd like to thank the State Library for inviting me to speak today. I actually have one deaf in one ear, so if I sound a bit weird, then I can't help that. I have a legacy item. Thank you to the State Trustees. I managed to put Grandma on the front cover of my book. So no damn females. So said Major General Neville House VC, the Director of Medical Services Overseas for the AIF in World War I, who was adamant that he did not want female doctors in the Australian Army because he had enough problems dealing with the thousands of female nurses who were already serving with the Australian Army Nursing Service. The frequent movement of nurses in and out of Australian and British hospitals across multiple continents had created a steady flow of paperwork and issues which he struggled to keep ahead of. Certainly, record keepers during the war found more than enough problems keeping track of the AIF nurses, as those did actually in charge of the service, such as the two matrons-in-chief and the Director of Medical Services in Australia. The Australian Army did not make it easy for women to fit in during the early years of the war. Its paperwork reflected the pre-war status quo, where all was focused on the male soldier, even though the Australian Army Nursing Service had existed as a reserve. So the AIF system was not set up to include women, and even the recruitment process for nurses was different to that of men, with one result being that nurses did not get a regimental number assigned to them. This, of course, makes research a little more difficult. This was also evident in the forms that were used in their personnel files, such as this pre-enlistment medical report. Nurses were often known only by their last name, so finding someone called Smith or Williams is even more difficult than for men. They were often also indiscriminately called nurse, sister or miss, so their rank is no indication of their actual seniority. I've been asked today to help you in your search for relatives who might have been a World War I military nurse or a volunteer nurse, commonly called a VAD or VAD. So my presentation today is about how to find the nurses you are looking for. I would start by asking two questions. The first is, are they a trained nurse? Many VADs, the VADs from the Red Cross, were also called nurses when in fact they weren't a qualified professional. If you're unsure, then the first thing to do is look for the nurse's probationer training at a hospital, registration with a nursing association or state board, or the passing of hospital or association exams. And I'll give you some more detail about this. Second, is there any evidence they actually served overseas? If yes, there might be army or organisational records. However, if they only served in Australia, they are unlikely to be formally listed anywhere, but might gain a mention in a local newspaper as becoming an army nurse or war nurse. Primary sources, particularly for 1915, are lacking a lot of detail for nurses, so researchers have to look for evidence in nursing association records. In this period, there were 4 organisations which registered nurses at the completion of their hospital training and their association exams. And these were, as I've listed here, the Australasian Trained Nurses Association, ATNA, and although I've written here mainly in New South Wales, there were definitely some Victorian nurses that were members of this association. However, most were members of the RVTNA, the Royal Victorian Trained Nurses Association. Again, in South Australia, some belonged to the Royal British Nursing Association. It was a branch, and South Australia was the only state that had this association, which was actually based in Britain. And in Queensland, there was a nursing board that was set up there, where you registered there. And I'm mentioning all these different states because just because your nurse was perhaps born in Victoria doesn't mean they actually trained in Victoria or worked in Victoria. Nurses were very mobile. So these registration boards are often mentioned on these forms found in the nurses' personnel files held at the National Archives in Canberra, but available online for free. This is one of the most valuable forms as it can indicate a lot about the nurse's background. But it also can be misleading. For example, often the address listed is not the nurse's physical address, but the one for correspondence, often her parents or a next of kin. And the nurses were very fond of altering their age, particularly downwards. Every nurse who wanted registration, and registration became more important as time went on and was necessary for army enlistment, had to complete 2 sets of exams. their hospital exam and their associations. Some nurses also belong to more than one association, e.g. Queensland and South Australian nurses often had the Australasian Nursing Association membership as well. Both ATNA and the RVTNA published a monthly journal which recorded the nurses who passed their association exams and then those who joined the associations. The Victorian journal is kept here at the State Library, easy to access and photocopy, and the ATNA journals are kept in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. As well as the registration details, these journals contain lists of nurses who went to the war, letters from them, and reports about them, so they can be most useful to consult. Fortunately, many of the nursing exams are publicly recorded in newspapers. Both the major associations conducted exams twice yearly, and lists of the successful candidates are normally published in the press, such as in this list here. Of course, there are also always newspaper typesetting errors to consider, and often the papers use what I call the nurse's nursing name. For example, Bessie Proudfoot, grandma, was actually christened Florence Elizabeth Proudfoot, but all her nursing papers are in the name Bessie. To complicate researching her, after the war and after she was married in 1925, she was known as Betty, or in her newspapers by her husband's name or initials, as was the convention of the time. So she was Mrs. G.T.H. Harris. So for quite a number of years I searched for Betty Harris and wondered why I couldn't find her. So researchers need to think quite laterally when looking for these women. For example, when journalist Peter Rees published his book on World War I nurses, he wrote that the book featured a woman called Kath King, and I thought, wow, he's discovered a new nurse that I don't know anything about. But I quickly realised he was actually talking about Lydia Kate King, and Kath was the name her descendants used, and it wasn't the name that she used when she was a trainee nurse or when she was in the army. To complicate issues, many nurses use their second name or a nickname, and army clerks often use initials, which in reality should be the other way around. This is an extract from one of my databases. You can see how often different Christian names were used in the third column and the typing errors or alternate surnames in the second column. Nurses did not have to provide a birth certificate to enlist and thus use whatever name they wanted to, and age, I did mention that. Principal matrons in each state did look at their nursing certificates and their matron's recommendation, but in most cases we actually don't have these documents to know which names they used on these. There are many examples of nurses who put their ages down in order to enlist in the army. As you may be aware, army clerks are the bête noire of World War I researchers, as their ability to spell was particularly woeful. The greatest problem seemed to have occurred with people who did not have Australian accents, and a small percentage of nurses did come from overseas. Certainly phonetic spelling is visible at times in the files, and Elvie Agnes Connor, I've listed there, her name was spelt in 5 different ways, and I can't spell them all or pronounce them all, but included Elvie with an IE, Elva, Eli, LV with an EY on it. And she also had her name strangely recorded as LB Connor, and if you say it quickly you actually come up with Elvie Connor. Isabel Tate Borwick, who was born in Australia, has her surname spelt in 6 different ways: Borwick, Alwick, Bonwick, Bulwick, Browick and Bowick. So she must have had some kind of accent which made it difficult to understand her. Then, of course, we just have the issue of interpreting the handwriting on primary sources. Is that a J or is it an I or vice versa? Is it an L or is it a C or is it a G? Even after lots of practice, I have some difficulty, and if you're a genealogist, you know what I'm talking about. Other issues with names are multiple entries for the one nurse as they returned to Australia and went overseas again. Similar names and initials. For example, F.E. Williams could be Fanny Eleanor Williams or Florence Eva Williams. The inclusion of non-Australian nurses in records. Not every nurse mentioned in an Australian archive is actually an Australian. Many British nurses emigrated to Australia after the war, many of them married Australian men, of course, and they're often mentioned in newspapers as being returned nurses or war nurses. Both the State Library here and the Australian War Memorial hold material from non-Australians, e.g. nurses who didn't go to war from Australia or didn't have any Australian connection before the war. One other complication is that many nurses served with more than one service, and they went from the British Queen Alexandra Service to the Australian Army Nursing Service, or from the Australian Naval Military Expeditionary Force to the Australian Army Nursing Service. So that's why you might see multiple entries for people. Different spellings, of course, cause problems when searching, but Trove, is everybody familiar with Trove? Excellent. An educated audience, that's what I like. The online digitised newspaper service from the National Library, that's really helped researchers in one way by listening to the algorithm that they currently use, so that if one name's not spelt quite right, you can often still find the particular person you're looking for. Some hints for finding nurses in Trove. Examination lists and registrations are usually listed by first name and last name, but it might be the nurse's nickname used as a first name, e.g. Molly instead of Margaret. Nurses, when they were travelling, e.g. on passenger lists, are usually listed with two initials on the passenger lists, e.g. Sister K.H. Walker or Miss K.H. Walker if she wasn't in the Australian Army. And if they weren't in the Australian Army, they're often referred to as non-members on passenger lists of military folk. The most misspelt name I found is Isabel, and female names are often masculinised in records by accident, e.g. Alexandra became Alexander, Francis with the masculine spelling of Francis. Some more issues. There's one quite funny story from a book I found. And you've obviously just read it now. We are to call each other by our surnames, except Ethel Hall, who we call by her first name. So, as there are so many Smiths in the Australian Army Nursing Service, many of them added a Christian or family name to their surname to stop their mail and documents being confused with others. One Sister Smith, for example, became Sister Stanley Smith, and she added in her father's name. Some nurses actually retained the arrangement post-war. For some, it was a convention actually carried over from their training hospital. For example, Isabel Rose Everett Smith was known as Nurse Everett when she trained, and she made her Army surname Everett Smith. There's a small group of nurses who changed their surname when they enlisted in the Army, mainly from the very pro-British South Australia. These women with Germanic surnames quickly found it sensible to rename themselves. Thus, Nurse Dorsch became Nurse Dorr. They must have done this with the acceptance of the principal matron, as all their hospital papers are in their original surname. But if you're looking for someone from South Australia and you can't find them, just remember that. British records, unlike Australian ones, are actually filed by the nurse's married surname. 24 nurses in the Army were already married on enlistment, but only the 18 widows used their married name. The rest used their maiden name. For example, Mrs. Fiacci, the Colonel's wife, actually enlisted as Nurse Amy Curtis and was pregnant by the time she reached Egypt and, of course, did this much nursing. Quite a number did not disclose they were married either before or during enlistment, as marriage meant discharge in line with the convention of the time that married women did not work. This is contrary to, you could belong to a British nursing service and be married. It was only Australians that thought that we should be conservative like that. When I first started researching in the 1990s, there was no nominal role in existence for the Army Nursing Service. There was a nominal role for the AIF in Army records in Melbourne, a compiled but incomplete secondary source which was used by historian Jan Bassett. And I found 3 or 4 published lists of nurses during the war which appeared to be primary sources. Several books, secondary sources, had lists of nurses, but often in the compilation there was no Christian name given, or sometimes not even initials, so it was difficult to know who Sister Jones or Nurse Smith might be and which nurse service they had nursed with. Years later, there still isn't a complete and published nominal role for the nursing service. Some tried to create one after the war, someone did, and you can see that many files have this S number listed in them. You can see the S1012 written there. Unfortunately, whoever started on this program stops at the surname starting with K, so we know who's in the first half of the alphabet. In line with this practice, whoever the person was that did this indexing also gave nurses who married an N number. So if you see an N number on the file, that gives you a clue that they were married sometime during the war. However, some of us now have significant databases, but we can't actually agree how many nurses there should be as the number keeps growing. My database, which has more than 2,286 names for the Australian Army Nursing Service, specialises in including the work that nurses did. Others focus on the personal and family history. Some are online, others are not. If you've been doing any World War I research, you would have come across embarkation roles. These were on microfiche before digitisation started, and I spent a lot of time in the Australian War Memorial. At first I thought that embarkation rolls would give me a list of nurses, but I quickly discovered there were quite a few nurses for which there were personnel files, but they were not listed on any embarkation roll. It seems that some Western Australian records didn't actually make it to Melbourne for inclusion. Then it was evident that the nurses of the first contingent that left Australia in October 1914 were missing from nursing lists, but they were eventually found listed with the battalions they sailed with. So if you can't find your nurse on an embarkation list, do not despair. In fact, the Australian War Memorial coyly notes, the data included in these rolls is only as accurate as the source data recorded at the time the rolls were completed. As a result, there are several errors of fact and omissions. Sometimes an alias may have been used, a surname incorrectly spelt, or an age incorrectly recorded or given by the individual. So here's a list of the roles where you can probably find nurses' names. You can see they all start with AWM, A subclass 26, which is medical. Now, of course, a simple search on the National Archives of Australia website using B2455 as the reference number, that's for World War I files, and putting in nurse or sister or matron will reveal the existing personnel files. While we probably wouldn't do this when searching for a soldier, some make the assumption there will be only one Miss E.H. Williams, when there might be two. Researchers therefore can link the wrong file to the wrong person. I encourage you not to assume that E.H. Williams is at the National Archives is actually the right one, but actually check it out. They're free, you can download them. Incredibly, there are two nurses with the unusual name of Olive Greer in the Australian Army Nursing Service, and they're both from Victoria. Only their middle names are different, so it is quite easy to make a mistake. A word of caution. Some secondary sources which are great to read do not subscribe to what is called an academic standard. That is, they actually contain references to sources, and where quotes are shown, usually indented in the text, they are words direct from the nurse's diary or primary source, such as their letters. There are two popular texts, one which is still available for sale, where the author has actually manufactured the quotes from the nurse's diary, and in the process, in some instances, has completely changed the meaning of her words. Much of the research done in this space for women is not conducted by professionals, but by well-meaning researchers whose attention to detail is not a primary focus. So if you find something about your relative, check the primary sources. My favourite family historians are the ones who provide a full citation where they found their information, e.g. author, title of the book or document, the publisher, the date and the page number. And this will allow anyone to find the same material again. Of course, hundreds of nurses served outside the Australian Army. I've listed here all the organisations I've found so far, but it might not be complete. I've been looking for names for some 10 years and still only about 10 days ago found a new name. We think it might take us all of the Anzac Centenary to be kind of really sure we've got most people. Of these, the most numerous are numbers of nurses served in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service Reserve. Almost 300 Australians served with this organisation. The reservists should not be actually confused with the regular QAs. These were career Army women who wore a different uniform to the reservists. In fact, they wore the same red cape as the Australians. There are about 30 nurses who served with just the privately run and organised Australian Voluntary Hospital in France, and another 30 who served there but went on to work for another organisation. The AVH later became known as number 32 British Stationary Hospital. Other organisations I've listed here have quite small numbers of Australians serving with them, but still it's important to note that there were plenty of places that nurses served. My database currently has about 1,000 other nurses serving outside the Australian Army Nursing Service. Of course, not every nurse served with a military organisation. Many trained nurses also served with the various Red Cross societies, which were often in charge of the better-known VAD volunteers. In looking for information on nurses, primary sources tend to be the most reliable, but what constitutes a primary source? These days, many researchers will start with websites, but how do you know the information has been transcribed or interpreted correctly? Websites are secondary sources, so you need to be careful. Many well-meaning researchers can lead you completely astray. For primary sources, there are various places to look. I've mentioned the nursing associations, and two of them had journals. UNA was for the Victorian Association, and the Australasian Nursing Journal for the Australasian Association in Sydney. So there are lots of other places to look at the Australian War Memorial. I mentioned the embarkation roll and the nominal roll. There's a roll of honour for those who died, and 21 nurses died overseas during World War I. 4 died when they came back to Australia, but before they had been discharged, and 4 died with the QA reserves. Probably the most interesting archive for researchers is the interviews that Matron Kellett did at the War Memorial. There's 128 interviews there, so if you're looking for a particular nurse and she's listed, then you're going to get quite a bit of information. I've mentioned photos there, but don't treat photo captions as gospel. They may be incorrect, and many of them have had to be updated. Other primary sources, I mentioned the National Archives files, the nominal roll I mentioned. Of course, there were some books written by nurses straight after the war. May Chiltern wrote The Grey Battalion, and Letters from Anne Donnell. It's quite a well-known book, and I think they're both available here in the library. Of course, hospital archives themselves can contain quite a lot of information about World War I nurses. And most universities around Australia also have some information about nurses. There are some nurses actually had university qualifications, and some of the people who served in the Australian Army Nursing Service were actually trained masseuses who had trained at universities. The RSL does have, on occasion, has files as well for those who took membership with the RSL after the war. And of course, state libraries, like the State Library here, has some diaries and letters and photos. Overseas, the National Archives in Kew in England, its online index shows W0399 is the reference number you need for personal files relating to nurses. And there are also medal index cards for those nurses who served and were awarded medals in World War I. Unfortunately, and unlike in Australia, these files are not free. They're not terribly expensive, but they still will cost you. I've been alerted to this Find My Past as being a site where you can find British military nurses. I haven't actually gone into myself. The British Journal of Nursing Archives is a great source. Often you can search for a nurse who's received a mention in dispatches or a Royal Red Cross or military medal. Often are listed in there, and some of the more unusual organisations are listed in there. So if a nurse went off and served with the Free French Nursing Corps, she might get a mention in there. There's also the British Red Cross volunteer files. I can tell I took this screenshot some weeks ago now because they're gradually bringing all these files online, and they're up to M now, last time I looked. So there were hundreds and hundreds of us non-nurses who went from Australia who served with the Red Cross or served in some informal way overseas. So it's worth having a look in there if you're looking for your person. And of course, there's plenty of websites there to look at. There's war memorials in nearly every town in Australia. More importantly for nurses are honour boards. Those from churches and schools and hospitals usually list nurses. There are lots of books and articles available. I myself have written one book. Only $35, see me later. And I think I've published about a dozen articles. There have been 19 books written solely about nurses in World War I that have, in Australia alone, because we have such great records that we can look at and talk about. There are many other books, of course, that have other information, and there's always Trove. Well, again, a note of caution about the newspaper articles in Trove. Although they're 100 years old, they're not necessarily primary sources of the time. So one should think about whether the newspaper articles are correct. I treat them as guides to help me with my research. A little bit on where you won't find information. I'm surprised every time someone asks me, and they ask me once every couple of months about can they interview a World War I nurse, and I go, yep. So the last I know died in 1998 when she was 104. And if only I had known, because I started this work in 1998. There are no databases that exist at the Department of Veteran Affairs or the RSL, but the DVA is starting to digitise the pension files from World War I. I have found membership cards in RSLs. Neither the DVA or the RSL could actually tell me when the last nurse died, but now that I've alerted them to the fact that they should kind of pay attention to this, hopefully they might be able to tell us when the last World War II nurse dies. I'm not that confident, but you never know. Of course, there are military hospital unit war diaries, which you can find at the Australian War Memorial, but often these histories who actually had nurses attached to them make no reference or very little reference to the nurses and don't contain names to help you with your research. Some of the problems you might kind of come across is there are in some books that have been published 5 or 10 years ago, there are very outdated lists of nurses. I mentioned about using caution with websites, and that includes the Australian War Memorial. I'm currently running on first-name basis with the photos curator there because people tell me about, is this caption correct? I find it's not and have to go and ask for it to be corrected. So the Australian War Memorial is not the font of all knowledge. Be careful about assuming anything in Australian archive belongs to an Australian, and don't always assume that all official files are correct. I found a fabulous example recently where it said that 2 nurses belonged to the Australian Veterinary Hospital. Unfortunately, of course, the Veterinary Corps in World War I actually didn't have an Australian veterinary hospital, and it really was the Australian Voluntary Hospital in France. I mentioned there at the end fakery. World War I had a reasonable number of men who pretended that they had been to war, and you may have heard of some men being thrown out of the RSL for pretending they'd been a Vietnam veteran. There are also some women imposters. The newspapers mention a couple of them, but one that tricked Patsy Adams-Smith was a Western Australian nurse who recorded an interview, which is stored here in the State Library, of a woman who supposedly had been at Gallipoli in France, military medal, Croix de Guerre, the works. Didn't leave Australia, sadly. Some nurses also went to war, but were promptly returned when it was discovered they didn't have the necessary qualifications. Nearly finished. Most researchers do not realise that there are 2 Australian Army nursing services, the AIF, who served overseas, and the AMF, who served in Australia, usually called Home Service. Any nurse that listed after mid-1915 generally had to complete some home service time before she went overseas. This helped her understand military systems, conventions and ranks. The B2455 files in the National Archives are supposed to be for the AIF and those who served overseas. However, some home service information can often be gleaned from these sources. Many nurses returned to Australia during the war and was discharged from the AIF, and many then joined up for home service. Others went to home service when they returned at the end of the war due to the Spanish flu pandemic. One thing to be aware of is that each time a nurse went overseas, they completed, or supposed to complete, new enlistment papers. So you may see in some people's lists multiple entries for the same person, and this could be why. The National Archives says that if it's a B24555 file, then that person was definitely on active service in the Australian Army. Unfortunately, that's not true. A whole series of the South Australian Home Service papers, such as this one here, being given the wrong reference number by the Australian War Memorial, which I'm trying to correct. There were many nurses who only served in home service, more than 400 at present count. When you add in all the nurses who also served overseas, we're looking at more than 1,000. I consider this actually to be a very low estimate, as documents from number 5 Australian General Hospital here in St Kilda Road state that the hospital, that one hospital alone, sent 400 nurses overseas in World War I. Gertrude Andrews is an example of a nurse switching between two services. The items in red show her service in Australia, and of course in black show her overseas service. So it's, to go between one and the other is not unusual. Just to help you, every book published on World War I nurses usually has a list of abbreviations, but here are the most common ones. And one I should point out is AAH is not the Australian Army Hospital. I'm starting to see this more and more often. It's actually the Australian Auxiliary Hospital. Which hospital? Only 800 of the Australian Army Nursing Service did not serve in a British hospital during the war. So you can see the experience of most nurses was completely different to that of Australian soldiers. Here's an example of one nurse who was posted to both British and Australian hospitals, the red showing the British hospitals. As a general rule, if the posting does not show an A or the word Aust or Australian, it is likely the hospital was a British one. I've used the abbreviation BSH to denote a British stationary hospital instead of ASH for Australian hospital, but most files do not include the letter B when referring to it. And I've listed down the bottom there a website which provides a very useful list of British hospitals in France. This is actually Florence Graham, the same nurse from the previous slide. Here's her actual file, so you can see it's quite easy to get confused about where and when people served. Army nurses often have the name of their service recorded incorrectly, particularly in newspapers. And so I've listed here ones I've come across, which you might come across. If you were in the Sea Transport Service, Hospital Transport Corps, the Army Nursing Service, the Army Medical Corps, or often called a Red Cross nurse, you most likely were, and if you're a trained nurse, you're most likely in the Australian Army Nursing Service. People ask me, does rank matter when you're recording nurses? The ranks during the war in the Australian Army Nursing Service were from lowest upwards: staff nurse, sister, matron, principal matron and matron-in-chief. Nurses who were sisters or matron in civilian life could end up being staff nurses in the Army, as there were a limited number of sister and matron positions. During the war, staff nurses who'd served more than 2 years overseas were automatically eligible for promotion. So a promotion should not be seen as something special, except for the fact that the nurses earned a bit more money. And this information is contained in their files. Nurses called their superiors by the correct rank and title, but soldiers called nurses either nurse or sister and didn't mind which they used. So don't read too much into the rank afforded nurses in soldiers' writing, nor in newspapers. When you're researching just one nurse, it becomes difficult to contextualise your information into something meaningful and correct. It's common to find people applying a 21st century interpretation to World War I nursing and nurses, so I think it's important to understand there's a little comparison. Most nurses before the war did not work in hospitals. Nurses of 1914 were independent societal leaders, mostly working outside hospitals. They were professional, qualified and trained in the management of others, of hospitals and business, as well as looking after patients. Many went to the war after long years of experience, some as city and country hospital matrons, and others having run their own private hospital. Most were career women who had experience in private nursing, where they were paid to treat people in their own homes, just like doctors. They're also very mobile, moving interstate for work or overseas for training. Some recommended sources for you. Your nurse may have served in a lot of countries or only one. To find out whether this is normal or not, I recommend you read some books that make good references. I've given there the official medical history of World War I. There's a chapter on nursing, but Butler also refers to nurses in his other volumes as well. I recommend Dr. Jan Bassett wrote in the late 1980s a book called Guns and Brooches, which is it contains more than just World War I. It's a very good indication of the administration of the Australian Army Nursing Service during the war. There are some very fantastically researched state-based nursing histories, which list nurses and what was happening in the state of affairs both before the war and after. And many hospitals these days are now writing their own nursing history, not just a hospital history. And so the Melbourne Hospital, the Alfred and St Vincent's all have these books published already. And of course, there is the fabulous one and only. The reason I mention my book is because at the back I list all the nurses I was able to find their training hospital for. So if you're looking, you can research nurses by hospital. I've also given a great list of all the places where the nurses served and with multiple spellings, because nurses served in a whole lot of countries that Australian soldiers didn't go to at all. And of course, you can always talk to me. You can find me, I've got a World War I page on Facebook, if you're on Facebook. A list of my articles are readily available via the university or from academia, and I'm easy to find if you put my name in Google. And I'm always happy to help people who are looking for people in their family. So thank you.